my personality is very goal driven. I set a goal, I accomplish it, I move on. There's really no time to rest. And what I've had to realize the last year or so is that that can't be the focus anymore because it starts to take me too far away from what I originally did. And I'm in it for the long haul. So I want to stay connected and passionate.
That was Shannon Albert of WDW Prep School. And you're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks for joining me here on episode 105 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. I hope you're doing okay, being safe, staying healthy, and also just hanging in there. I'm recording this intro on Sunday, May 31st, and it's a really tough time for our country, the world right now. The killings of George Floyd and so many others, justifiable protests around the country. It's a lot to take. So I feel a bit odd just continuing to do a theme park podcast, put interviews out there, given everything that's going on. But I do know it is important, for all of us to have ways to cope with the pandemic, everything else, through our passions, our hobbies, through art, through things we're interested in. And that's what I do with this podcast. Try to, especially in recent months, but even beyond that, just find a way to make sense a little bit of the world through theme parks. For me personally, I'm trying to recognize how much privilege I have and helping out however I can every day. Not really talking about this podcast just in general, but I'm going to continue to keep releasing episodes because it helps me just to have something to really throw myself into right now in these times. My guest today is Shannon Albert from WDW Prep School. I talked to her first in August 2018, really enjoyed it. She had a lot of interesting info about her background, starting a business. It is her business to provide helpful information about Walt Disney World, has a travel agency, gives a lot of tips, does a podcast. And I reached out to her again because I wanted to talk to her, one, just about what's been happening with her business since it's been a few years, but also two, given the COVID-19 situation, what it's been like. And the interesting thing is we recorded, like I mentioned during the show, last Thursday, May 28th, and the day before Disney announced their reopening plans. So that was not planned. I did not jump on and say, hey, Shannon, let's talk after that happened. But that gave us a lot to talk about because obviously Walt Disney World is going to be reopening in July. And Shannon, given her job and her business, is going to be there. And I wanted to get her perspective on what Disney announced and what they're doing, and also how she's going to approach it from her business. And of course, since that point, we talked on Thursday in the middle of the day, Disney has announced the cancellation of fast passes, the dining plan, so many other things. So you can see how fast the news is moving. Now it's been approved by the governor, so it's going to happen, but it just shows you how quickly the news is rolling in terms of Walt Disney World. And of course, near the end, we also talk about some things Shannon has enjoyed recently at Disney Springs and Galaxy's Edge and all that. It was a really fun conversation for me to learn more about what Shannon's currently doing with her business, and then just Disney World's reopening in this new environment and what that might be like. So here is Shannon Albert. Shannon, thanks so much for returning to the podcast.
Yes, thanks for having me, Dan. I'm a repeat guest. I'm excited to talk to you.
Of course, yeah, because we first talked back in the summer of 2018 a lot about your background and kind of the origins of your site. But I know there's more to cover, and especially given all the news that's happening right now, it's starting to ramp back up. So it's interesting. But I'd love to know for you personally, before we get into that, like what's been happening with your business in the last few years?
2018 feels like a lifetime ago, even though it's only 2 years. But in that time, I created a travel agency. I think that's probably the biggest change. It seemed like an obvious fit with the website because in business terms, the website is a lead generator, and I could choose to send those quote unquote leads to another agency, or I could start my own and then have more quality control because I'm the one hiring the agents. I'm the one that gets to define the processes and all that kind of stuff. So I decided to start my own agency, and I was told with somebody at Disney that it was the second fastest growing in Disney history. So we're off to a good start.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah. And I can tell just based on what I've seen that you're definitely growing well and doing a lot of cool things. So, I mean, for you personally, I know you mentioned the travel agency, but you just celebrated your 8-year anniversary and had a podcast about that of the site. So how have you changed your approach just in terms of how you look at the business and even what you do for it?
That is an interesting question. So the first several years, I really worked 70 hours a week and never took time off. I worked 7 days a week. It was very, very, very hard. And I would say the last couple of years have not been like that for a couple of reasons. One is I've hired people and they do it, so I don't have to do it anymore. But obviously that takes money, and I had to get to the point where I could afford to hire people. And secondly, just on a personal level, I had a lot of things happen. I got divorced, and my son was in and out of the hospital, and just a lot of different things happened. So I couldn't keep up with that pace anymore. And now that life is calmer, and at least in terms of those things, not in terms of pandemic, I'm just kind of used to that now. I'm used to letting other people do things. I'm used to having a more sane schedule. So I'm glad to be at this point because those early years were tough.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's probably not a healthy thing to be working that much for a long period of time. And, I mean, it's good for ramping up the business, but at some point it has to change. So what's it like being a boss versus doing so much of it yourself and kind of having it be just your thing?
Yeah, that's been an interesting evolution as well, because the reason that I even started this kind of job was because I have a passion for helping people learn how to do things that make their lives better in some way. And it's really fun to use different types of creativity to get there. So I design graphics, I write articles, I have a podcast, I have at times done videos, social media. So it's all very like creative, different outlets for teaching people how to plan trips. But as you hire people, you become more of a manager. And that is a totally different skill set. And it takes you kind of further away from the thing that drew you in the first place. So I have actually, my personality is very goal driven. I set a goal, I accomplish it, I move on. There's really no time to rest. And what I've had to realize the last year or so is that can't be the focus anymore because it starts to take me too far away from what I originally did. And I'm in it for the long haul. So I want to stay connected and passionate. So I have a small team. And so there is a level of management there, but I still get to do a lot of things. Like I am one of the people that manages the social media. I host the podcast. I write the weekly emails. Sometimes I write articles, although other people primarily do that now. So I'm still connected to the content. I still host Q&As sometimes on social media. So it's been a good balance between managing a small team and still getting to create some of it myself.
Right. Yeah. Because it's not a case where all of a sudden you're just like up in some tower and saying, do my work for me. It's very active, as I can tell. And you mentioned wanting to help people. And I know you've been doing a lot more, I think, with Patreon, which is a way to connect obviously more directly with people. What's that been like for you to kind of work in that, and then also just to connect more directly with people that are really big fans of the site?
Yeah, I started Patreon. I can't remember the date, but it's been in the last year or two. I can't remember. And it was kind of hard to figure it out at first. I wasn't sure what extra benefits I was giving people. And for people that are listening that may not be familiar, Patreon is something you can pay to subscribe to and usually get exclusive content. So if you watch YouTubers, they will often do separate videos there, or you get them earlier. And in my case, I have a podcast. And so they get different content on Patreon than you do on the main feed. So it took me a while to kind of figure that out. But I would say when I remember this sort of, quarantine pandemic time, it will be associated with Patreon very closely in my mind, because we kind of dove in on Patreon because they're an enthusiastic group and they are a separate kind of revenue stream. And I don't mean that to sound gross, like I view people as like sources of revenue. But the truth is that they were people that were interested in more content. And that was one way we could provide it, because people weren't really reading the website. There was nothing to research with no trips being planned. So we kind of just dove in and started doing different things. We've done Zoom calls. I play games online with patrons. They get a whole separate podcast. It's nothing like the main feed. It is me and Heather, who has worked with me for 5.5 years, and we're very good friends. So we kind of have chit chat a couple times a week. We call it happy hour chats. And it is a much more like loose version of me. I feel like I have two personalities my whole life. I've had this very like professional, together, G-rated, person that goes out into the world. And then privately, I'm very silly and irreverent and laugh a lot. And the two versions of the podcast kind of represent that. The main feed is my more serious version, and then this Patreon version is the silly side. And Heather brings that out in me. So it's been really fun. We also have a Facebook group that's just for the patrons, and so we interact a lot there. And we just really got to know people a lot. And during our trips, we schedule meetups with patrons. I've never been willing to do meetups because it feels very self-centered to be like, come meet me. But the patron group is small enough that we can do that and just hang out and have a drink with, a dozen people, and it keeps it manageable. So it's been definitely one of the best things I've ever done, but kind of was a messy process figuring it out. But now that we're here, I love it.
Well, that's great. Yeah, I do Patreon too, but I've yet to be able to really master it, I think, like do a lot of the things you're describing. And you bring up a good point too, just about kind of our current situation with the pandemic and how the parks aren't open, and just ways to connect with people in a different way. And I think it's great. All those things you're doing sound really fun. And I'm sure, personally, as someone who's interested in the parks, having ways to still connect with fans or to talk about them and do different things is a great thing. But I'd love to know too, for you, what's it been like basically since March, when things shut down? I'll focus more in just on your business and on, with the parks being closed. How has that been for you, just given that we're going on almost 3 months of this?
So very difficult. I lost 90% of my website revenue overnight, and that's the primary source of revenue for my business. I think a lot of people might be surprised to know that. When you own a travel agency, I think people assume that's going to be the, most of the revenue. But for me, it's website revenue, and 90% of it went away. There were a few things that worked in my favor. One is savings. I had a lot of business savings. I did get the PPP funds, that has been in the news a lot. And I was in the first round of those funds. And I cut some expenses, including my own salary. And also our revenues are on a delay. So we're still receiving revenues that were earned months ago. But after this month, there will be crickets when it comes to getting ad revenue checks, because there was not much earned over the last few months. So far, so good. But we just had to make some really hard decisions. And ultimately, there's a dollar amount in the bank, and you're trying to deplete it as slowly as possible. And that's what we've been trying to do the last few months. I will say I'm pretty resilient. And so after the initial shock of everything that was going on, I was like, okay, let's figure this out. And so it's been mostly okay, but certainly not ideal. But that's true for most of us, I think.
Oh, yeah. And 90%, it's interesting because part of me thinks that people would still, be interested in going and reading pages and stuff. But it's very different than when things are coming out constantly, like new news. There's no new news about new attractions or about restaurants or even just tips and things. It's all just kind of in this blurry gray area. So that has to be a real challenge. And it sounds like, I think we're heading to a different level soon here. But it's interesting to think about just how challenging that was. But it sounds like you're hanging in there as well as you can, at least.
Yeah, hanging in. And, that small team I referenced earlier, I am really thankful it's a small team because a bigger team would be, that much harder to figure out. So we've been able to stay busy and create things during the downtime. When we're updating a website all the time and news is coming out, we have to balance the news plus trying to make progress in other content areas. And now without the news, we've been able to make a lot of progress in some of the projects that we've had on the back burner. So yeah, not ideal, but trying to make the best of it.
Yeah, totally. Because the one very small benefit, and I would never like to think of the pandemic as having a benefit in any way, but in some way, at least that you're able to do some of those things. So that kind of leads me into news that, we're recording this on, I should say probably the exact time because things could change so much. We're recording this on Thursday, May 28th at about noon Central Time, just to give you an idea of where we're talking right now. But yesterday, Disney finally came out. We had heard earlier about Universal's plans and how they're planning to open around June 5th, but Disney finally has announced what they're doing. So I would love for you, as somebody who covers this so closely, kind of how you're approaching this. And I mean, I'm not saying what you think too soon or too late, but what do you think just about their plans in general? What's kind of your first reactions to it when you heard about it?
I think they have done a great job putting together their plans. A lot of people, there's a lot of feelings about if people will travel to the parks or not, but the people that are willing to go often will say, I trust Disney to do the right thing. And I think Disney doesn't take that lightly. And although most theme parks in Orlando are opening late May or in June, they are not opening until mid-July. And I feel like that was a thoughtful discussion. Many people still think that's too early, but I think compared to their competitors, it is much later and they're taking extra steps. So I appreciate that they're taking that. I was critical of them for not closing sooner. I felt like they were encouraging people to congregate when we were all supposed to be staying at home. That was a couple of days that I thought that they had missed there. But in general, I think they do a great job of making thoughtful decisions. And I am looking forward to going back.
Yeah, and I'm right with you on the scenes of everyone at Main Street those last weekend. I was just like, oh my gosh, this is like, it kind of gave me a visceral reaction. But in terms of now, I was actually a little surprised. Like I was kind of going in thinking, okay, well, Universal's doing this and Legoland's doing this. Disney's going to do 2 weeks later or something. So I would say in a good way, I was surprised, where at least I look at it and I say, and Bob Chapek explained this. I read an interview where he said, we're the largest entity and we have so many factors and moving parts. And I thought, oh, that actually makes a lot of sense. So I appreciated that. But I guess we should kind of pull back a bit. I'm guessing people listening to this have already read it, but just to really summarize, July 11th is when they're going to open 2 parks, and then Disney is going to open their other 2 parks on July 15th. And I know there's a lot more details. They're also going to open DVC resorts in, I believe, June 22nd. That's a basic summary, but Shannon, you have a really good page that kind of summarizes. I saw an image you put on Facebook that was very good. I'll link to all that when I put this out. But I'm curious too, you mentioned you're going to go. Are you going to be back there right away? And were you able to get in reservations? Because I know they locked everything down pretty quickly on that yesterday.
Yeah. So before the announcement, we actually had reservation July 1st because that was the soonest that you could book it. For the last couple months, that was the soonest date. We had one just in case. And then we also had one for August 1st. And that's because that was my personal guess. I didn't say that publicly, but August 1st was my personal guess. So we just had both of those booked as just in case. And then, of course, they announced July 11th. And while we were watching the task force meeting over public television or whatever you call that, we booked the room that would be for those dates, July 11th through the 18th, I think is what we're booked right now. And then shortly after they closed down the reservations. So we did get a reservation but we just really in the nick of time. But we do sometimes get invited to media events. And if they have one, it's possible that if they have one and we're invited, it's possible that we'll be there a day or two before that. So in either case, we're going to be there as soon as we can.
You bring up a good point about media events, because I feel like, at least, I mean, they did announce too, they're not going to do fireworks. They're not going to do parades. They're not going to have character meetings, though they're going to be there. But also too, I think it's almost like it's going to be so different, not just wearing masks, which everyone's required to do, and the cast members and guests, but also how they're going to handle queues and everything. Have we heard anything so far about virtual queues? I mean, that's my expectation based on Universal and others, and even what Six Flags is doing, that Disney would do that too. But I don't think they announced that very clearly yesterday.
No, I think they're waiting for official approval of their plans to say anything. They have said there's going to be an advanced reservation system. And early on in the, isolation pandemic period, we noticed in the My Disney Experience app, it used to say virtual queue because that was referencing the Rise of the Resistance queue, and it changed to plural, virtual queues. So we had, some reason to believe that they would start using it for multiple rides. We also have Shanghai as an example, and they had a media preview there where they had people come in and see how like every other row on Pirates of the Caribbean was going to be seated. And when you're staying in line, you have to be spaced out. So that means the lines can be very long. So yeah, I suspect we will learn a lot more about Disney World's plans very soon.
Yeah, I have a feeling that before this podcast even comes out, that there'll be more information also too, possibly on I don't know if they'll reveal the percent of people or the capacity of the park that they're going to put out there. A lot of other things I've heard have been like 25% and all that, but I know that's not official. So it's going to be interesting. I mean, I'm thinking of this more in terms of like, if I was going with family members and everything, and I have kids, and I'm not in a hurry to go back for that reason, but I know for you it's totally different going from a business perspective. But I mean, how do you expect this is going to be even going to the parks? I'm not asking you to predict what it'll be like, but just personally, how do you feel about what that's going to be like, given that you're going to be going so early on with how everything's working?
Yeah, I think there's going to be an eerie element to it to have so few people and everyone's wearing masks. But, this is our temporary normal. So we'll just have to see what that's like. I also think before you even get to the parks, the transportation itself is going to be maybe one of the biggest differences because they can't pack people in those buses like they're used to doing. And for that reason, we're renting a car for our first trip, something I do not like to do. I am happy to let other people do the driving. But we're renting a car because the logistics of that seem so difficult. But we will test out the transportation just so we can offer a perspective on both. So I think that alone is going to be interesting. But the parks themselves, I think it's going to be eerily quiet and without so many people and without the entertainment. So I look forward to finding out, even if it's not what we're used to seeing when we're there.
Oh, totally. I'll be fascinated. I mean, fascinated sounds weird. It almost makes it too positive, but I'll be interested to see how it goes, because I saw clips of even Disney Springs. This was before the Disney stores opened, which I think had lines, and just seeing so few people walking around, and everything was just so different than what I'm used to kind of being there, and just being I wouldn't say a madhouse, but just kind of so busy. And same with the Shanghai images. It just seems so different. And I think it's going to be that way for a while. But yeah, it's tricky because I'm excited that the parks are opening, but also kind of, like anyone, have reservations, concerns about what might happen. So I'll be interested to see kind of how everything goes. And really, like you mentioned, the transportation is a great point, because I've been on so many. We've all been on those buses when you're kind of like, how am I even standing up straight? I'm kind of like between four people and everything. And I wonder the long-term impacts on so many things. I'm not just talking next month, but beyond. So I think renting the car is a good idea, but I'll be following closely when this happens, because it's a new world, and I think it'll be that way for years.
Yeah, and I'm not sort of over the top optimistic about other people's viewpoints on going, but I sort of view our role in this as twofold. One is, I think the people that are going to be interested in going are people like you and me that get to go all the time. So we just want to see it in all of its forms and are willing to put up with a less than ideal experience just to be there because we just want to go. So that crowd, I think, is we need to provide information for. But the other is people that don't want to go right now and can kind of listen to it and to follow and live vicariously through people that are and just sort of get their parks fix secondhand. So I think it's very different. Normally I'm thinking about everyone planning trips, but I think we're probably at least a year off from most people being willing to do that.
Yeah, I agree. And that's a good point too, because there is somewhat a reassurance to the fact that, oh, Disney World's open. That means it doesn't mean everything's fine, but that means, okay, I can see some sort of light down the road where things would change in a positive way or something. So you also operate a travel agency, and I'm sure you're going to get a lot of questions just on that. I'm just curious for you, how does one approach that now in this? I mean, I'm sure you're just having your agents read so much information, but is that something you're thinking about now, like how the travel agency will respond to questions from people, like you said, that may not be ready to go yet?
We definitely are focused on the future, so whatever that means for people. If you're tired of being at home, why don't you get a trip on the books so that you have something to look forward to? And for many people, that will be next year. Disney opened up next year's reservations early. Normally, they don't open them till June, but they actually are available now for people that want to look forward to next year. We have a group trip booked. I went through Adventures by Disney and I had a private group booked. So we filled that group. And we are getting ready to offer another group to another Disney for a different Disney product. So we're sort of trying to look for the future, get people to think ahead. But that is difficult in the short term because a lot of people are canceling for this year. So that's been tricky.
Oh, I can imagine. And I mean, there's so many moving parts to this that I'm sure as we get to know more, there'll be a lot more clarity about everything. But I want to make sure we talk about some other things you've done too, which one thing is you've been doing interview podcasts during the shutdown, which I personally, obviously, do a lot of those. So I'd love to hear what it's been like for you to kind of, I know you interview people for trip reports, but to do more interviews with other content creators or even people like the voice of Mickey Mouse and others that kind of taking a different approach to what's that been for you?
Yeah, that has been really, really fun and definitely something that has been unique to this time period. I've been wanting to do it for a long time, but it is very different than what I had been doing, which primarily was interviewing podcast listeners who talked about their own trips, or I would do solo episodes where I would just come on and talk about, Disney dining plan or whatever. And then I also have my own trip reports because I'm in the parks once a month usually. So it'd be like one episode a month would be my trip report, one would be somebody else's, and then a couple other like solo episodes. And that's kind of been how it's gone the last couple of years. But obviously there's no trip reports happening when we can't travel. And I thought, that interview thing that I have had on my mind for a while, this is the time to do it. And people that are being interviewed have more time than usual. So it was a really good fit. But it is a totally different skill set. I have a lot of respect for people like you that do it because there's a lot of prep work and you have to figure out how to structure the conversation around your prep work, but also be in the moment and let a conversation flow. So that's been really great, but it has been so fulfilling. And I think I'm going to keep doing it.
Well, great. Yeah. And I've always told when people ask, I always say 90% of it is the prep. Like the talking now is the fun part. That's easy, but it's like, the trying to prepare and be ready and all that is so much of it. So I'm glad to hear you're enjoying it because like you said, I feel like it's very different to do that than even kind of what you've done before, which also are very difficult. Trip reports to me are very challenging to sum up. So to kind of take another avenue is really cool. And I know you've also done more, speaking of trip reports, you've done ones with your assistant or with Heather, who you work with so closely, and kind of had more when you do the two of you together, which I found entertaining. What's it been like to kind of, rather than you just reporting, to have someone that you kind of talk with on a show? How's that been for you?
Yeah, she brings out the best part of me. So I enjoy, she and I mostly just do Patreon content, but sometimes she is on the main feed with me as well. In fact, she's the one who created the 8th anniversary episode, which was crazy because it was my first one that I hadn't planned for myself, but she did a really great job. Yeah. So I have to confess, though, the first time I had her on the podcast last fall, I believe it was, we did daily updates from a trip that we were on. And it was a totally different version of me that people weren't used to hearing because I was very silly, especially at the end of a park stay when you're laughing hysterically and just delirious. And so it was a very different side. And I all of a sudden got very nervous because I thought, what if people criticize this version of me? What if people criticize her? Like, I just can't handle that because she's very sensitive. And so that was when I decided to take that version of the podcast and put it on Patreon because that felt safer. Like, let me be my professional version of me that's a little less vulnerable publicly, and let me do the sillier version privately. And that way, if people want it, they can have it, but it's not what's on the main feed by default. So that's worked out really well. But yeah, she's come back occasionally for the anniversary episode. And then as we discussed the reopening plans, she is with me on that. So it's been kind of fun to have her pop in and out, and she's getting more comfortable with it. So it's better. It makes the podcast longer, which I like because I'm a rapid fire gal. Like when I'm by myself and I have my bullets in front of me, I just buzz through them so fast. So my solo episodes tend to be pretty short for that reason. I don't like to hem and haw much, but it's nice to have a conversation so that it, has a little more leisurely flow to it. So no, that's been good. And I'm not overthinking things quite so much as I used to. I used to really sit and think about, okay, if I'm going to interview people, how do I do it? What's the process? What's the procedure? How do I reach out to them? If I have Heather on, do we do this? And now I'm just like, let's just do it. It's not that serious. So it's been good to have her on. It kind of chills me out a little bit.
I'm not familiar with that, doing a short thing. I think I did a trip report of just myself and it was 2 hours. So I need to go the opposite direction when it's just me. I feel like interview guests kind of rein me in, but it's glad to hear though that you've mixed it up and been able to kind of connect in that way and do some different things. But I know you also mentioned too in the past that you're really interested just in podcasting kind of as a medium, not just as a way to present the site, but really just about the format and where it's going. So I'd love to hear from you just what excites you about the format, because podcasts have been growing and I think will continue to do so, especially as more people go back to commuting and everything.
Yeah, I am obsessed with podcasts, but even as a teenager, I was listening to AM radio, talk radio. Like I just love talking, and certainly talk radio for a teenage girl was not I was not the target audience for that. But so I've been excited about podcasts ever since they were created, because then you can find the content that you want to listen to. There's a kind of a Wild West element to it. I think it's gotten a lot more polished the last few years. People have better microphones or better editing, but I just have always loved it. So that's why I created a podcast. I didn't have any experience with it. I didn't know what I was doing, but it turns out the passion I have for that medium has translated, and I think people feel it when they listen.
Oh, for sure. You can definitely tell when people are really into just podcasts in general, not even just Disney shows, but like the format. You can kind of feel it when they're doing their shows. But I'd love to hear from you. What are some of the shows that you gravitate towards in any genre that, as far as podcasts?
Yeah, I don't do Disney content at all. And that I think is confusing to people, but it was my escape or my hobby for a very long time. And now it's my job. So I have to have other hobbies. And so I'm not going to, in my free time, spend more time on my job. But my escape, it happens to be drag queens. And so the podcasts I listen to, YouTube videos I watch, TV shows are all drag queen related. I had a famous drag queen on my podcast recently because she's obsessed with Disney parks, and I met her last year. So drag queens tend to be my thing. I also love long interview shows. So there is Armchair Expert, WTF with Mark Maron, a lot of just comedians, Whitney Cummings. They have these interviews. So they're like funny people who get serious when on their podcast and are pretty introspective. So those tend to be my two favorite types of content.
Well, excellent. Yeah, I listen to a lot of long form interviews too myself. Yeah, I mean, so many good ones. Fresh Air, Mark Maron, a lot of comedians are doing just, I don't have the time to go through so many 3-hour shows and stuff. That's the challenge for me, is finding the time, even with the few shows that I do catch up on, because they're going so far in depth. But that's what's great about the format, is that you can do that. And a lot of times people will listen. It doesn't have to be 30 minutes or an hour or anything like that.
Yeah, so that's what's sort of funny about me doing short podcasts, is the ones I listen to are usually really long. But, they interviews, I think, lend themselves to being 1 to 4 hours long. And I'm excited to listen when the host is somebody I really like.
I feel like, too, that also helps because in any genre, Disney or whatnot, I mean, I know I totally understand about your job, is if you just listen to shows that were like yours or focus like yours, your show's going to end up, without even trying, it's going to sound a lot like the shows you listen to.
Oh, see, that's another thing. I don't want to copy. I want to be my own person, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. It makes a huge difference. All right. Well, I'd like to ask you, too, about some other things that have opened at Disney recently, and then things you enjoy. It's definitely a difficult time right now. So I still want to have some fun talking about things that we like. So I know one thing that's happened since we last spoke was Galaxy's Edge opened on both coasts. And I went there last year and saw the Florida version, but pre-Rise of the Resistance. But I'd love to know for you, just what do you think about that expansion and kind of your experiences there?
So I will confess, first of all, that I'm not a Star Wars fan. And I just don't like sci-fi in general. So I was really scared that this new land, which I knew was going to be pretty popular, would be lost on me. But I love it so much. It looks like a movie set. And I love how much the cast members are into it. It's incredibly immersive, which I know that they promised, and they 100% delivered. So much so that when I leave Galaxy's Edge, I'm almost disappointed that that same immersion doesn't continue. So I do love it, even though I was a little skeptical beforehand.
Well, that's good to hear, because, the one feedback I've heard from a variety of people, I mean, I enjoyed it, but I also have a lot of Star Wars background from being a kid. I wouldn't say now that, I mean, I'm a Star Wars fan, but I wouldn't say I'm like, I don't get all the references now just because, life and having time to get everything. But it's good to hear that you enjoyed it being not a fan, because I always wonder about that when I go in there, especially given that they're focusing on the new films. It's like, are people getting as much out of this? So that's great to hear that it is working for you, because I wasn't sure that would be the case.
Yeah, it does help Heather and I almost always travel together, and she's a big Star Wars fan. So it definitely helps to have someone that is a fan. I can appreciate it more. Other people's joy is often my joy, so I can kind of secondhand feel that through them. But yeah, I do enjoy it, and I've just tried to pick up the things that I find particularly fun. Like making a droid is fun. I don't care if you're a fan of Star Wars or not. It's fun to put together the parts of a droid, and it's fun to go to Oga's Cantina. The music is fun. The drinks are good. So I think there's a lot of it that you can still appreciate, even if you're not a fan.
Oh, totally. And, I haven't experienced Rise of the Resistance yet, but I know that having that attraction, which is so high tech and immersive and all that, you probably don't have to be a Star Wars fan to love that, because, I mean, when Disney does something that's that, regardless of how well it actually works and doesn't shut down, but advanced technology, when it's working on all cylinders, it's going to be something I suspect that would be cool to do, because it's just a top-notch theme park attraction.
It is top-notch, and it is incredible. A lot of people put it on par with Flight of Passage. So, there's a debate to be had. Which one's better, Flight of Passage or Rise of the Resistance? But it is very well done when it works. That's another case of me watching people, because there are a lot of different steps to that attraction. I'm not going to spoil it, but there are a lot of different steps and elements to it. And every single time I just sort of stand back and watch, because it's just incredibly fun to see people's reactions, especially if it's their first time.
We were planning to actually be in Disneyland right now, but obviously didn't happen. So I was really excited to check it out, but I'm sure I'll be doing so soon. So flipping it around a bit, though, one of the challenges with Rise of Resistance is the boarding group process, in a way. I mean, for you, I'm curious, as someone who has a travel agency and is giving out tips, how tricky is it to explain that process if someone is not like a theme park obsessive and doesn't read blogs and everything so much?
Here is the fortunate or unfortunate of truth, depending on how you look at it. The more complicated Disney makes things, the better it is for business. Because if it's easy, people do it on their own. They aren't Googling, for websites. They aren't booking through an agent as much. So the more complicated it is, the better it is for us. And we have been on Rise of Resistance a lot and certainly have that process down. I will say, though, that the way Rise of the Resistance was working right before it closed, well, since it opened, is incredibly difficult for people that aren't followers of sites like mine. And in fact, just a few minutes late, you could totally miss it on that ride. So in February, I don't do personal trips that much, but in February, I went with my son. He's 18. He's not an early riser and he's not a Star Wars fan. And he did not want to get up at 5 a.m. so that we could go get a boarding group. And so there's a lot of those decisions being made. A lot of people aren't willing to get out super early. We literally had 4 and 5 a.m. alarms every single day during our last several trips because of this boarding group thing. And it's fun as a competitive person, but not everyone wants to do that. And I think that's kind of unfortunate. I do hope that changes in some way, but I don't really know what the alternative is, because if people just line up and stand there for 7 hours, that's bad too.
For sure, yeah. Because, I think of it in terms of virtual queues sound great, but I even think with my family where we were going to go, and we are not early risers. They're not rope drop. We typically, that's where Fast Pass Plus is helpful. But in this case, I mean, at least in Disneyland, if we're going to stay close, it's easier than getting on a bus or getting on a car and going to the Hollywood studios. But it's still, I was like, okay, we're not doing it the first day. We'll try the second day, and hopefully that'll work so we don't have to do it every day. But it's a challenge. I think that's me who knows what it's about. So it's interesting. I'll be curious to see, with virtual queues in general. I mean, obviously other ones are not going to be like Rise of the Resistance, but part of me is just wondering how that's going to work when things reopen. For that attraction, I assume it'll have to be similar, but given just the lower capacity and not having people crowding around, there's just a lot of elements to this. It's going to be interesting.
It is. It didn't have much uptime before the parks closed down, but Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway is also worth trying to ride. I'm a huge fan of it. And I don't know if your virtual queues will be used for that or what. But having both of those rides in the same park is going to be, it's going to be tricky.
Well, yeah, because when I went, it was when Smuggler's Run had opened, and we got up at like 4 a.m. or 4:30 because it was opening at 6. But then because of that, you were able to I did like every headliner before 9 a.m. But now with Runaway Railway and Rise of the Resistance, it's just totally different. I mean, I guess it's good that there's so much focus on Hollywood studios given how it was, but it's crazy. But I guess it'll be good when we can have these types of challenges for guests rather than nothing like right now.
Yeah, it definitely used to be a lot easier to navigate. I used to have challenges where I'd go to Hollywood Studios and navigate without any fast passes. I can't do that anymore. But it's definitely tricky, and it's been keeping us on our toes. We have touring plans on the website, and we have to update them. Well, we were updating them about once a month, which is a lot when you're having to update entire articles constantly. And it makes it tricky for people planning, because if you're going 5 months from now, you can't use the touring plans that are available now when things are going to change so much by then. And we're certainly going to embark on a lot of changes over the next several months. So we'll see.
Yeah, but you mentioned there is going to be so much complexity. So given that it's your business, people are going to need assistance, as I will say, even more than usual. We
are obsessed with teaching people. So we're excited to get there, learn it, and tell other people.
Well, excellent. Well, one other thing that has continued to grow since we last spoke was Disney Springs, which had opened, but now just has kept adding new restaurants and shops, and seems to be, I mean, I haven't been there as much as I'm sure you have, but just very popular and a good change given where it was. So what do you think has worked really well there, or what do you enjoy to do when you go there?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Disney Springs. I used to skip downtown Disney regularly on trips because it just wasn't a must do. But Disney Springs to me is a must do now. And I'm not a big shopper, but certainly if you are a big shopper, there's lots of shops there and that are give you lots of fun merchandise that you might not have had access to before. The co-op happens to be my favorite and a lot of people's favorite. But obviously, you have the World of Disney still and other options. But the restaurants are definitely the focus there. And then there is a new Cirque du Soleil show that was supposed to open in April. And once it does have a chance to reopen, will be a part of the Disney Springs experience. So I love it. I will confess, though, that I still cannot navigate it. That whole center news section of Disney Springs is like a maze to me. And so I always have to have the app open on my phone to show me the right path to get where I'm going, because it just doesn't make any sense to me no matter how many times I've done it.
Wow, I used to get a little turned around at Downtown Disney years ago, and that was like 100 times simpler. So I will just end up like continually going in the same direction and give up and end up eating at Earl's Sandwich, which is not what I need to do. There's lots of good places. That sounds challenging.
It is very challenging, but worth figuring out because there's lots of good options.
Definitely. All right, well, I want to finish with, I'm not calling this rapid fire because it never works, but just kind of a quick collection of kind of different questions about some favorite things that you like to do at the parks, if that works for you.
Mm-hmm. Let's go.
All right, great. So very simple question. What is your favorite resort to stay in at Walt Disney World?
The Contemporary. And that is because you can walk to Magic Kingdom, which is such a pain to get to normally. I love being able to walk there. You can view the fireworks there every night that they're available. They won't be in the near future, but when they are, that's great. And I love all of the food options at the Contemporary Resort. So it is my favorite, and it's where I chose to stay with my son when I had a personal trip in February.
Excellent. Yeah, I haven't stayed there in a long time, but as someone who, especially if you have a car, oh my gosh, but even so, the Magic Kingdom is the one that the only one of the four that really kind of bugs me to get into. So and it's a really cool resort too.
We were laying in bed one night, my son and I, during our trip, and I didn't have tickets to Villains After Hours, but all of a sudden it was like 8 or 9 p.m. And I was like, you know what? Villains After Hours isn't sold out. You want to go? And he said, yeah. We threw on our shoes and headed out, and we were there within, 10 minutes. And I was like, we couldn't have gotten there that quick if we were anywhere else.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah. I mean, yeah, anywhere else you would be like, oh, we got to wait for the bus, or we got to get an Uber or something. It would just be too much. So very cool. Okay. So this is more about your business, but what is a go-to tip that you like to use for first-time guests, that just one that you end up saying over and over, or that you're putting on the site?
Well, in general, I think we have a 6-step planning process, which I think helps avoid a lot of common problems. So I would start there. But more specifically, I would say I like to advise people to make their Fast Pass and dining reservations in order of difficulty and not chronological order if they're staying on site. Does that make sense?
Oh, totally. Yeah. Because if you go, it can come down to, with like Flight of Passage and others, it can come down to a couple minutes. And plus, whether you can go and write it at 11 a.m. or 7 p.m. or something, it's huge.
A publication reached out to me one time and said, what's your favorite tip for first timers? And I told them basically what I just told you. And they printed it as Shannon Albert from WDW Prep School advises making reservations in advance. And I was like, nope. That
yep, that's true, but that's not really that unique.
That's not very clever. But it's the order, because I think the tendency is that people will make them day by day by day, and then you miss out on things like Flight of Passage, like you mentioned.
Totally. Yeah, that's a great tip. Okay, so I love the Animal Kingdom Lodge and their food especially. So assuming you've been to these three, of Jiko, Boma, and Sanaa, which of these is your favorite?
I have been to all three. My son's a foodie, so we tend to go to all of the nice restaurants, including those. I love them all. I would say probably I like Sanaa the most. I think probably Sanaa, but I could definitely just get bread service there and be happy. And if you don't have a reservation, you can go to the lounge bar kind of thing and do it. So probably that one, but you can't really go wrong there.
No, you can't. And there's really cool views there too if you can get those windows that are kind of near the animals. So that's you get the bread, watch the animals. You can't go wrong.
Yeah, I think that's a good tip. Make your dinner reservation before sunset, so at least you have some time to experience the view.
Totally. All right. So these are a little goofier, but I like these sometimes. If you only had an option of visiting one of these 3 counter service restaurants at the Magic Kingdom, which would you choose? It is Pinocchio Village House, Cosmic Rays, or when it's open at Tomorrowland Terrace. Which is the least bad?
Least bad is such a funny question. My son, by the way, does not even know Cosmic Rays exists. He is so oblivious to the fact that there are regular just like burger and nugget places at Disney World because I didn't raise my kids eating that kind of stuff and they like other things. I would say Pinocchio Village House is definitely going to be my pick on that list because they actually have some good flatbreads and you have the opportunity to view. It's a small world. Like there's a window that you can watch the ride.
That's probably the best choice. Cosmic Rays, I mean, there's the goofy animatronic, but the food, oof.
I will say though, I have to stick up for Cosmic Rays a little bit. They started offering better things there, and I like their mobile ordering. Not all mobile ordering lines are created equally, and I like mobile ordering there and some of their stuff, especially during the parties in the past, like during the Halloween party or Christmas party, had good food. So I have been eating there more often for that reason.
Yeah, and that's a good point about mobile order because a lot of the places now are so much easier. The things that were really frustrating, like the lines at Cosmic Rays, especially when they had the separate 1, 2, 3, 4 that drove me nuts, are now not such a big deal. And then mobile order lines like Aloha Isle, for example, where I stood in the mobile order line for 15 minutes and went, this might not be the best approach. So that they're not always equal. That's a good point to bring up too.
They are not, but Cosmic Rays, for its previous faults, does have some perks.
Okay, so one more business question. What is a common misconception that people have about how you run your business or about what it's like to have a business about Disney?
Oh, they think it's all fun and games. It is definitely my top pet peeve is when people will ask me, how do I do your job? And that frustrates me so much. I know that it doesn't come from a mean place, but I just think, no, you would not have been willing to work 70 hours and make no money for years and all that kind of stuff. But I have been working on an internet marketing website, basically teaching people how to run a website like I do. It's not ready to go yet. But one of the reasons and motives for doing it is so I can send people a link to it and be like, here's how I did it. That way people know there's a lot of thinking that goes into it. It's not just the going on trips and posting a picture to Instagram.
Yeah, read this and come back to me then. Read this first. That's the idea. Okay, 2 more questions. These are about things in the future. So, which of these upcoming restaurants, I'm making the assumption they're all going to open, are you most excited about? Roundup Rodeo, Space 220, or the Princess and the Frog restaurant at Reflections, assuming that opens?
Oh my gosh, this is a Sophie's Choice because those all have great things going for it. Having a table service restaurant in Hollywood Studios, another one, is going to be great because they don't have enough, in my opinion. And then having anything Princess and the Frog related, incredible. If you're on the Disney Wonder cruise ship, they have Tiana's place, and it's like my favorite place on the boat. So that's fun. I do question the location, however, at Disney World.
Yes.
It seems like it'd be a better fit at Port Orleans Riverside or Port Orleans French Quarter. And then there's Space 220. So I'm going to go with Space 220 because it's almost done. It was supposed to have already opened by now. So we have a good chance. I don't feel like I'm going to be let down by that. Like if they're not going to cancel it. I also think it's a very unique experience because it looks like you're 220 miles above the earth. So I'm going to go with that one. But I think all 3 are pretty great.
Yeah, and I think that's what I would pick too. But you make good points because, I don't know if I'm going to head right over to Reflections. I'm sure you will, again, assuming it opens, basically because, you're covering it. But for me, it's like, that's pretty out of the way if I'm not staying there. So I think the Space 220's got a lot going for it. Again, I know it's been delayed a lot, so I hope it opens soon.
I think it will. Knock on wood.
Yeah. Okay. Last question is pretty straightforward. I know a lot of things may not open, but I think all the big headliners are going to continue. So of the giant headliners, your Tron, Ratatouille, Guardians, all those types of things, which are you most excited about coming to Walt Disney World?
I'm a coaster fan, which, that sort of coaster itch doesn't always get satiated at Disney World because they are not trying to compete with, the big coaster parks. So having Tron and the Guardians of the Galaxy coasters is going to be, I think, super fun. Probably, let's see, Guardians of the Galaxy is probably the one I'm looking most forward to. It's huge. It's going to be the biggest indoor roller coaster in the world, I think they said. And so probably that one. But I do think Tron's going to be super fun. And we're so lucky to be the only Disney park to have both that and Space Mountain. So, but probably Guardians of the Galaxy.
You bring up a good point about coasters because I also like coasters a lot. And while there are some thrilling parts to it, both of these seem like with the launches and just with being indoors. And yeah, I haven't been to Shanghai. So for me, Tron looks really cool. And like you said, that building, I think they said it's like you could fit 4 spaceship Earths inside it. And it's, but it's, I don't know what they're going to do with the coaster in a building that size, but it's something that's going to be impressive.
I agree. And the other two that you mentioned exist in other parks. So there's less mystery. I mean, I've never ridden them, so that'll be fun. But there's less mystery to it. That Guardians of the Galaxy one, who knows?
It feels weird in Epcot, but I think that they're spending an insane amount of money. So it's going to be ambitious for sure. So it's going to be cool to see. So, Shannon, this has been a blast to do once again, and I'm excited to learn more about what's coming at Disney World and then, of course, at WDW Prep School. So if listeners want to connect with you or just learn more about what you're doing, where should they go?
Well, you can always go to wdwprepschool.com. That's the main hub, the website. But also, if you're on social media, just search WDW Prep School on any platform, and you'll find us there.
Awesome. Well, this has been great. And I think there's going to be a lot of changes. So some point down the road, we should check in because it's going to be crazy. But thanks so much for coming on the show again.
Appreciate it. It's been fun. Thanks, Dan.
If you enjoyed this show, I would definitely suggest you check out my first episode with Shannon Albert. That is episode 49, which was from August of 2018. It talks more about her background and a lot more. You can find that and a lot more at tomorrowsociety.com/podcast with an S at the end. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can go to tomorrowsociety.com/member, where you can make a small monthly contribution, get some really cool perks, and also make a huge difference in supporting the show. I wanted to give a shout out to 2 of my latest members, Scott Trewick and Nate Nunnally. You can also leave a one-time donation at tomorrowsociety.com/tip jar. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you can email me, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. Follow me on Twitter at tomorrowsoc or Facebook or Instagram at Tomorrow Society. The Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next time, I will be talking with Todd McCartney of the Retro Disney World podcast. We talk about restoring old films, Horizons Revisited, so much more. Please be safe out there. Wear masks. Take care of yourself. I know some of the parks are opening. If you do check them out in Florida, have a great time, but also follow the rules and be super careful. Thanks so much for listening. I'll talk to you again very soon.